Today we're going to build a tree with every possible dominant chord that I could think of. But first of all, let me just tease a little bit what's coming up in 2024 for this channel. The last month or so has been amazing and we're going full steam ahead in the new year. I'll be trying to do about 2 videos a month. There's going to be some music theory, of course, piece analysis. I'm going to be analyzing some of my own compositions as well. I'm thinking also of doing some more personal videos on stuff like why I quit piano performance, why is neoclassical music so boring, including my own, and stuff like that. Also, I'm releasing an album in May with piano and basically an army of synth, and I'm really excited to share that with you guys. So if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on these things. Okay, if you're new to chord theory, better have a look at my previous video on how to build chords, because here we're going to take basic chord building for granted, and we're going to delve super deep into dominant chord theory. So the reason why I'm doing this video on dominant chords and not, say, on third degree chords is because the fifth degree, or the dominant, is probably the richest degree in terms of all the little alterations, tweaks, extensions that you can add to make it more varied. Although the third degree is also fascinating because you have a minor 7 chord with a flat 9 on top, which Adam May says is impossible, but it's not true. But back to dominance. If there is an equivalent of the law of gravity in music, it is the motion of going down a fifth. Why this is the case is not entirely clear to me, but I suspect it's the equivalent of entropy in music. The same way that things in the universe tend to go from higher concentrated energy to more sparse and low energy, when you go down a fifth, you're basically relaxing into the previous harmonic. So this is why the fifth degree is considered dominant. It's because it's the degree that suggests most strongly a resolution to the first degree. You could think that the quintessential dominant tonic motion would be something like that, but it's not. You're thinking too much in terms of chords and not enough in terms of melody, which is the most important. I would argue that the quintessential dominant tonic progression is something like this. You're going to get this in jazz as well, except it's going to be enriched with extensions. This motion has been so frequently used that my harmony teacher in university, a wonderful, wonderful woman, Luz Baudet, was calling it le motif clé, the key motive. And don't be surprised that the 5 chord doesn't have a fifth. In pretty much all the chords I'm going to show you, you can easily remove the fifth in the chord because the fifth doesn't really add much to the sound. So le motif clé has 3 different things going on at the same time, like 3 dimensions of gravity. First, the fifth is attracted to the tonic, a fifth below. Then, at the same time, in parallel motion, the leading tone is sitting so close to the tonic that it kind of gets swallowed by its gravity. Finally, another G is going to go down, but a little bit less so, and it's going to rest on the E, which is the third of the tonic chord. The presence of the leading tone is really the most important characteristic of a dominant chord. Whatever happens on top of it is basically ornamental. It's a question of shading. You can add a bunch of extensions that are going to coexist with this leading tone. You can even substitute the bass a tritone away. We'll get into that later. But you're almost always going to have this leading tone sitting a half step below the tonic. Now, in classical music, this leading tone is going to resolve to the tonic most of the time. In jazz, more often than not, this leading tone is going to stay where it is because it gives us a nice major 7 on the tonic chord. This does not make the leading tone less important in jazz, because even if it doesn't resolve, it's still doing its job of creating tension by being so close to the tonic in the first place. Okay, so let's bring back the fifth in the G chord and see how we can manipulate this fifth. If you have a simple G chord, pretty much the only alteration that you're going to see is augmenting the fifth on that chord. This makes the G chord a G augmented chord, so going from this to this. It makes the dominant chord more quirky and more magical as well because it suggests the whole tone scale, which is a meme for magic. The way I see things, and this may not be historically accurate, but the way the 7th was invented is something like this. Someone took this and was like, hey, what about we just fill the gap between these 2 notes? Like, and someone else was like, no, you've just invoked Satan. And the tritone was born. Wow. Some folks will argue that the tritone is the essential characteristic of the dominant harmony. But I don't agree with that, because not only in early classical music, but also in pop music as well, very often 5 chords don't have sevenths, but so they don't contain a tritone, but their function is not compromised at all. It's very clear that they're dominant still. So I think people are going a little bit crazy with this idea that the tritone is like the foundation of everything. Still, the tritone is very important because it surrounds even more clearly the destination chord, and it creates an even stronger expectation. Note that the tritone will generally resolve in contrary motion, so one voice is going to go down and the other is going to go up, or vice versa. Let me add a little side note here that's going to apply to the whole tree. So basically all of these chords can have their third suspended, or the leading tone suspended. And if you master the art of the suspension, it's going to add so much richness to your music. Everyone loves a good suspension. This will be written sus4 in a chord chart because we suspend the third of the G chord on the fourth. This temporarily hides the leading tone, so it creates another layer of expectation. So first you're going to be expecting this fourth to resolve to the leading tone, and then you're going to expect the dominant chord as a whole to resolve to the tonic. Just as an example of how you can go further with suspensions, you can do all that, and then you resolve the bass to C, but you keep the dominant chord on top. And finally resolve to C. So a suspension is basically when some of the voices of your harmony linger on a previous chord while others have already arrived. So we've taken a basic 5-7-1 and we've enriched it a lot just by blending the colors a little bit together.
Make all the trees you want in your world.
So let's try to see how we can manipulate our 5-7 chord without adding any extensions or inversions. Just like we could sharpen the fifth on the G triad, we can sharpen the fifth as well in the G7 chord. Sometimes you're going to see this written as 5-7 flat 13th because the flat 13th is the same note as the sharpened fifth. When you're in a major key, it's going to be written as sharp 5 because this sharp 5 is basically going to be an approach of the major third, like in Stardust. In minor keys, you can get the same chord, except it's going to be more an anticipation of the minor third of the tonic chord. Chopin loved to do this. It's basically his trademark. While we're talking about anticipating the third of the resolution chord, I'm going to cover the major counterpart of what you just heard, because you hear it a lot in classical music and it's not at all that crazy. So in the same way that Chopin was building a 5-7 chord and putting a flat 13th on top, which is the anticipation of the minor third, composers, even before they started doing this in minor, they've been doing this in major a whole lot. So building a 5-7 chord and adding an E on top. Typically this E will go down to D eventually and you'll be left with a normal G7 chord. So what you get a lot is this. For me, it's a dominant chord with a touch of nostalgia in it, but I don't know why. Where this originally comes from is that composers for the longest time have been preparing this dominant chord with the tonic chord in the second inversion, so 1-6-4. And so we talked about suspensions earlier. This is basically a double suspension. The bass is on the right note, but the two other notes are too high, and they're going to resolve to the normal G chord, and then this G chord is going to resolve to C. But let's say you resolve the lower one, and you still keep the E. You're not very far from having a G7 add 13th chord. The other way to play with the fifth is to make it flat, and this really opens up a Pandora's box of theory. So bear with me, everything will be fine. More often than not, you're not going to put a flattened fifth directly on the G chord, because the D flat is neither in the C major or C minor scale. It's just not diatonic to C, so it would make little sense to put it in the G7 chord, although it's not impossible. The way that this chord has been used a lot is as part of a tritone substitution. I'm not going to go into too much detail about tritone substitutions because there are good videos out there explaining exactly how it works. But basically, if you're in C major, instead of doing your 5 chord on G, like G7, you can substitute this G chord for the chord that's a tritone distance away, in this case D flat, and you can build a dominant chord, D flat 7, and still you can resolve this D flat 7 chord to C. The reason why this works is because both these chords share the F and the B, so they share the tritone. So this tritone is still operating. It's going to be a crunchier version of the same thing.
It also attracts jazz musicians, which, trust me, you do not want.
I'm kidding. Jazz musicians are cool. I'm actually jealous of their swag. They're very swaggy, you know. So on this D flat, it would be totally on point to use a 7 flat 5 chord, because the flat 5 would be G, you know, tritone away. And G is totally part of the C major scale. In classical music, you would think it would be simpler. Haha! It's actually going to be much more complicated, because I need to introduce another concept, which is secondary dominance. So when you're in a key, you have a main dominant. But because a dominant is just a way of forcing a resolution a fifth below, you could decide, hey, I want to force a resolution on the second degree. And the way that you would do that is by building a dominant chord a fifth higher. Now, you could do that for every chord in the scale, including the dominant. And so very, very often composers, like this is everywhere, composers are going to take the D minor chord and they're going to transform it into a D7 chord to get the dominant of the dominant. So there's the tritone substitution and there's the dominant of the dominant. I hope you're ready, because I'm going to combine these two concepts. So if you take the progression I've just talked about, D7, G7, C. So you have the dominant of the dominant, or 5 of 5, going to the dominant, or 5, going to the tonic, or 1. The thing that classical composers have been doing a lot is taking this 5 of 5, so D7, and substituting it a tritone away, which gets you to A flat 7. So we get A flat 7, G7, C. In classical analysis, we call this a German sixth for some reason. If you want to make it even more colorful, you can flatten the fifth of this A flat chord. So you get A flat 7, flat 5, G7, C. In classical analysis, they call this a French sixth. And it's basically the only place in classical music where you're going to hear a 7 flat 5 chord. In the category of substitutions, the other main substitution that you're going to see is, instead of approaching the tonic chord from the half step above, like we did in the tritone sub, we're going to approach it from the whole tone below, and we're going to build a dominant chord on that note. In this case, B flat. The reason why this works is kind of mysterious, but I think it has to do with the minor version of 5. So I said earlier that dominant chords absolutely require a leading tone. Well, all musical rules exist to be broken anyways, and actually there are plenty of examples of songs with minor dominants, minor 5 chords, such as Moon Dance.
Well, it's a marvelous night for a moon dance with the stars up above in your eyes.
You can even use a minor dominant chord in a major key. Quebec people are going to know that song, but the rest of the world definitely won't. Or there's this beautiful example by one of Quebec's leading neoclassical pianists, Alexandra Streliski, in the song Lumière. So when you're doing a B flat 7 chord, you're not very far from a, say, G minor 7 chord. So I have to react to a video that some other guy did on dominant chords, and he was saying that
in classical music, the various types of 5 chords are pretty finite. There's the good old triad, the triad with the 7 on top giving us the 5-7 chord, and if the composer is feeling really spicy within a minor key, you might hear them stack the flattened ninth on top. That's about as far as 5 chords get within the classical period of music.
So even if you just consider the classical style, which is different from the classical genre, this is not true. There are plenty of examples of flat 5s, 9s, 13s, flat 13s. I don't like to think of classical and jazz as being two different boxes. To me, they're a bit like a Toyota and a Mazda with like 98% of the DNA in common. The only difference is that for some reason, from Chopin onwards, classical composers stopped improvising, which is kind of dumb. But anyways, so a general idea that's very, very important is the extensions that you're going to put on top of your dominant chords highly depend on where you're going next. So if you have only a 5-7 chord, it can resolve both to a minor tonic chord or a major tonic chord. Even if there's normally a B flat in the scale of C minor, we don't care because we really like this leading tone, unless you want a moon dance.
Well, it's a marvelous night for a...
But we do care about the A flat though. So if you're trying to put a ninth on a dominant chord, it's super important that you know whether you're going into a minor chord or a major chord. The ninth is basically going to be a guide for the ear to know whether there's going to be a happy ending or a sad ending. This is why the major ninth is generally associated with lightness, positivity, happiness, whereas the flat ninth is generally considered to be the most dissonant interval in the tonal system. I'm about to hit one of the most misunderstood transformations of the 5 chord, which is to go rootless. I mean, sometimes 5 notes is just too much, you know. So what you can do is remove the fundamental. How can I remove the fundamental? It's the most important note. No. The leading tone is the most important. And because the leading tone and the tritone are still there, the chord has the same effect, except it's a little bit less clear where this chord is going to go. Because this guy, B minor 7 flat 5, can resolve back to C major, but it can also act as the 2 in a 2-5-1 in A minor. So it makes the chord more uncertain. If you do the same thing on the minor side, you're going to get a fully diminished chord, 3-3-3, which can still function as a 5 in C minor, but because of the slippery nature of the diminished chord, it can go to a bunch of other places as well. 3 other places to be exact, because it's constituted of 2 tritones, and each tritone can resolve by opening up or closing down upon itself. So what generally happens is a student is going to stumble on one of these diminished or half diminished chords, and they're going to be like, okay, this is a C sharp half diminished chord, and then it's going to D. End of the thought process. And it's a shame because you're just one little tiny idea away from everything making sense. If you can just realize that this half diminished chord is basically a 5-9 chord without its fundamental, then it makes sense why this chord was going to D in the first place, because D is a 5th lower. In reality, Schumann is going to approach this D with a double suspension that we were talking about, 1-6-4. A couple bars after that, Schumann does this, which, if you put the notes in order, gives you this, and this resolves to an A minor chord. So, okay, this is a fully diminished chord, G sharp diminished, but try to go a tiny little step further and realize that basically this is an E flat 9 chord with the fundamental missing, and that is the reason why it's going to A minor. So a good way to prove this to you is in Arabesque by Debussy. At the end of the first section, he goes like... So he's alternating between A sharp half diminished and F sharp 7 in a way that makes it very clear that these two things are not 2 different chords. They're just the same F sharp 9 chord. Okay, so 11ths. So because the 11th is basically a 4th, there's not much difference between an 11th chord and a sus4 chord, because if you play an 11th chord, most of the time you're going to remove the 3rd anyways. If we didn't, it would create a minor 9th interval, which is not in the spirit of this chord. The difference is suspensions tend to be temporary. So if you have a sus4 chord, it's probably going to resolve to its normal state and then go to the next chord. Whereas if you have an 11th chord, it's probably just going to stay there and directly resolve to C. This one is really, really happy, even more so if you add the 13th on top. A good example is this. Or really, any song by Wolfpack has a very high probability of containing a 11th chord at some point. Practically speaking, to build these chords faster, it's useful to think of them as a superposition of different chords. For instance, you can think about your 11th chord as being a D minor or D minor 7 chord on top of a G bass, or even F on top of G, or F major 7 on top of G, or even F minor major 7 on top of G, which introduces a flat 9 in this structure, which is really cool. Before we get to the sharp 11th, I'm just going to add another chord to the nostalgia land, which is a very close cousin to what you've just heard, the flat 9-13 chord. It's very interesting because it's basically a G7 chord with an E chord on top. And when you think that E would be the dominant of the 6th degree, which is the minor relative, it makes a lot of sense. It's like the major dominant and the dominant of the relative minor have kind of merged. It's like a fusion of the main dominant with the dominant of the minor relative. Sharp 11ths, though, are a little bit more elusive. Here's another Debussy example. has a dreamy, uplifting, almost magical feel. This is a very good chord to use on tritone substitutions because the sharp 11th will be the 5th of the scale. It's going to be even more on point if you put it on the flat 7 substitution, because the sharp 11th is going to become the 3rd of the tonic chord. And just like normal 11ths, you can always add a 13th on top of that to enrich the sound, but it's not going to affect dramatically the harmony. So that was the magical and happy section of this map. So remember our nostalgic flat 9 13 chord? We can flatten the 13th as well. And there would be a million jazz examples, but I remember this really funky chord in one of Chopin's Etudes, Ocean. So flat 9s can coexist pretty smoothly with sharp 11s as well. And here we're reaching maximum crunchiness with 5 sharp 9, flat 11, sharp 5 sharp flat 9, sharp 11, flat 13th. The important thing when you do these kind of chords is to maintain the level of complexity when you do the resolution. You can't resolve this to that. You need to add like 7ths and 9ths and 11ths to your resolution chord as well. If you don't, there's going to be a disjunction. Also, a neat trick is to organize all these extensions into 4ths so they blend well in the sound. So the only other thing that you can do with the 9th is to sharpen it, which is going to give you this funky superposition of an A sharp or B flat on top of a G7 chord. So basically you get the 2 thirds at the same time, the major third and the minor third at the same time. A super clear example of that is in O Moro Nautem Ves from Joao in Astro Gilberto. And it's beautifully fitting because this song talks about people living in the slum and like the spirit of the street, revolution and stuff like that. So it beautifully captures like the cacophony of the street. A beautiful way to make it even more offbeat is to add a sharp 13th on top of that. I couldn't find an example of that, and suddenly I remembered a lo-fi hip-hop beat that I did like 8 years ago, and the opening chord was this.
Expected.
So that's a sharp 9, flat 13 chord.
You want to search me? No, sir. You see my ID? No need.
So what all these chords have in common actually is that they're picking extensions from the altered scale. It can make it much more simple to think about it this way. So what is the altered scale? It's this. So you can build it easily by creating this little mountain between the fundamental and the third, like half step, step, half step. And then you go full whole tone mode for the rest of the scale. So like, I'm not a jazz musician. I know exactly 0 altered scale licks, but I know like, yeah, that it exists. And that scale basically contains all those bad boys, the flat 9, the sharp 9, the sharp 11th, and the flat 13th, as well as the tritone. So if you want to make a dominant chord extra crunchy, you can just pick and choose from this buffet. So you can see that any note basically can be integrated as part of the dominant harmony. Any note? Really? Except F sharp. Never have I ever seen a dominant chord with an F sharp in it. This is literally the only thing that's impossible. Because if you put the major 7th, you're essentially going to be negating all the tension that you've been carefully building and teleporting yourself in G major unannounced, which makes no sense. I will leave you with a quote by Milan Kundera, who wrote The Unbearable Lightness of Being. He said, "Kitsch is the absolute denial of shit. So when you got shit, better do something with it. Go dominate